What's up everyone, I'm Earl the Rookie Woodworker, and for today's project I'm going to go back to the roots and work on cutting boards again. For today's cutting board, it's going to be a simple straight grain cutting board that has a gradient line pattern to it. So it's a really simple, really easy project, but yet it's going to have a neat effect. So let's get to it. For this board, we're going to need two woods that have a sharp contrast for each other. For the first one, we'll need walnut, which is a dark wood. And then for our light wood, we'll use some maple. And that should give us a huge color variation to make this board really look good. So the first thing I'm going to do here before I cut these pieces into strips, I'm going to cut them to length. The finished board length that I'm going for here is 18 inches. So I'm going to overshoot a little bit here and go with 19 inches. Now the reason I cut these a little bit longer is to leave myself some room for error. So whenever I glue these up, if it's not quite perfectly square, I can make it square again after it's finished the glue process by cutting the ends off a little bit. Then after cutting them all up, I'll take all the pieces over there to the joiner where I'll get a nice flat side on it. That way I get a good smooth start for the table saw. Now that we're over here at the table saw, we'll get into the secrets of how this board has the visual effect that it has. So we'll start this out with a wide cut from both the walnut and the maple boards. Then we'll work our way down narrower and narrower and narrower pairs. I'm going to use the metric system for this because the metric system is a lot easier to work with when you have to do math. So for this first pair, I'm going to go with 50 millimeters wide. And then when I get to the second pair, I'll go with 75% of that 50 millimeters, which would be rounded down to 37 millimeters. It's 37.5, but I round down. So then the next pair will be 75% of the width of that pair, then the next pair will be 75% of the width of that pair, and so on, until we get to a really slim pieces. Now if you're making one of these boards, you don't have to stick with the same numbers that I went with. You can change those numbers however you would like. For example, if you wanted to, you could start with a narrower wide piece like 40 millimeters and go with a higher drop down percentage like 90%. That way you're only knocking off 10% with every pair. Doing something like that would have a smaller difference as the pieces got smaller, but it would also have more pieces in your board. So as I did this, I knocked off the decimal point every time I did the math on this, so I rounded down every time to the next millimeter. And it came out to a skinny piece to be 11 millimeters, which made the total board width to be about 13 inches, which was perfect for my planer. So at this point we want to organize the pieces. We want the pieces to go dark, light, dark, light, dark, light, dark, light. But you want the dark wood to be organized from the thick pieces down to the thin pieces. And then you want your light wood to be organized in the opposite direction. So they're going to go from thin pieces to the thick pieces. And then once we have the pattern established, it's time to slather some glue between all those pieces and clamp them down. These Harbor Freight clamps are great for this, but if you're using them, keep in mind not to go with too extreme of clamping pressure because they do at a certain point start to bow, and then that will make your piece bow as well. Then after the glue is all dried up, it's time to run over to the planer and run it through there, get it nice and perfectly flat, and get it all down to a uniform thickness. Then I'll use the miter saw to knock a little bit off of each end to get it nice and squared up and get it down to the final length. And then it's time for everybody's favorite part of woodworking, which is sanding. For me, I find 80 grit to be about the perfect starting point when sanding. It's pretty good for getting off machine marks from the planer or saw blade marks from the saw. Or if I use a drum sander, my drum sander, I run 80 grit on it, and it's pretty good to start with 80 grit to get the drum sander marks off of it as well. Then I go over everything again at 120 grit, and then I go over everything again at 220 grit. And then I'll use some water to pop the grain, use the 220 to sand all that off once the water dries away, and then I might do a second grain pop. Then for finish, I like to rub some mineral oil in it, which brings out the true, natural, beautiful colors of this wood. And then I'll let that soak in overnight, and then I'll wipe it all up with a paper towel, and then I will go back over it with a mixture of mineral oil and beeswax. That way we can really lock those grains. That way nothing soaks into the wood afterwards. And this is how it turned out. I really enjoyed working on this design. For a board that only takes an hour and a half to 2 hours, you really get a lot out of this board. But if you enjoyed this video, do me a favor, hit that like button. And if you want to see more videos like this, hit the subscribe button and head over to the channel. There's a lot more cutting board videos over there. But until next time, make something awesome.